Welcome to Astrology Explained. In this Debunking Astrology series, I examine the skepticism and criticisms directed at astrology, as well as looking at how astrology can improve using the same. Criticism is helpful when legitimate and genuine. The division between astrology and science is a silly one. Pseudoscience is such a dirty word in culture, and serious astrology has been relegated to the fringes of culture, while the superficial side of pop culture, sun sign horoscopes dominate. Regardless, it isn't seen by most as serious. I think that can change. Science is a tool to understand the natural world, and astrology is a tool to understand our psyches. They don't contradict each other, and in reality can enhance each other. Astrology is not a natural science, and that is okay. Astrology doesn't need to be, and astrology doesn't need to prove itself to the other natural sciences. Science answers questions about our natural world so we can better understand and utilize it. But science does not provide good answers to life's purpose or the intricate nature of the human psyche. A person wouldn't consult their astrology chart or an astrologer when they have a broken arm. They would go to a hospital. But in the same way, one wouldn't go to a doctor for issues related to their life's purpose, their deeper feelings, their mental processes. Astrology is more like psychology or philosophy or religions and spirituality. Astrology can use the rigorous standards of the scientific method, as well as legitimate criticisms, to improve the discipline. Astrology is not perfect. Using this checklist from the University of California Museum of Paleontology at Berkeley, we will examine, critique, and incorporate these criticisms and questions into our understanding of astrology. All right, starting out, astrology, is it scientific? Let's go through these checkpoints. You can read if you want, you can pause and read the first paragraph, but I'm just going to jump right into the checklist. So, number 1, focuses on the natural world. Astrology's basic premise is that heavenly bodies, the sun, moon, planets, and constellations, have influence over or are correlated with earthly events. And yes, astrology does focus on the natural world. If we use the broad definition, yes, astrology focuses on human beings and our experiences of life in correlation to the physical positions of the planets. It focuses on everything that makes us tick in our psyches, which in turn creates the social and cultural world we live in. There are fields of astrology that focus on the more mundane parts of life and look at current events and the happenings of the world. But even here, the focus is on the people. Astrology doesn't have as much success when it tries to predict natural occurrences outside of human influence. Number 2, aims to explain the natural world. Astrology uses a set of rules about the relative positions and movements of the heavenly bodies to generate predictions and explanations for events on Earth and human personality traits. For example, some forms of astrology predict that a person born just after the spring equinox is particularly likely to become an entrepreneur. Yes, astrology does aim to explain the natural world, again, with a focus on the human beings and our psyches, our behavior, etc. The main contention people have with astrology is the how. How do the physical planets control or affect us? And this is a very natural science's way of looking at things, looking for causal mechanisms, the physical. What astrology is a symbolic language and not meant to be taken as if the physical planets are affecting human beings. This might be proven to be true in the future, but regardless, for now it cannot be proven, and that is okay. Science doesn't necessarily disprove astrology, as much as astrology hasn't been proven to be scientific. There is much work to be done still much to learn about the human beings and our inner worlds, our psyches. In this, they use, for example, someone born after the spring equinox, so an Aries, being an entrepreneur. And they ultimately decided this was shown not to be true in their experiment. And this points to the disconnect between science and astrology, and the misconceptions about what astrology is, what needs to be proven in said experiment. They base the study on a specific assumption about Aries suns, when that assumption, being entrepreneurial, is part of the larger Aries archetype of, quote, being first and also being self-focused. If the study broadened to look at the expressions of the more fundamental archetype and not one specific way it can express, they might find different results. Entrepreneurs are considered first in a field or are considered to be more focused on their self. The more general archetype is there, and it doesn't mean that it has to express through the specific of an entrepreneur. Not all Aries become entrepreneurs, and that doesn't disprove astrology. And this is where we're getting into kind of the disconnect between the understanding of astrology from the scientific community versus what it actually is. That is a very simplistic way of looking at astrology and what the signs and planets mean, and is a huge issue that needs to be remedied through more serious discourse about astrology and discourse between the scientific community and the astrological community. Moving on to the next point. Uses testable ideas. Some expectations generated by astrology are so general that any outcome could be interpreted as fitting the expectations. If treated this way, astrology is not testable. However, some have used astrology to generate very specific expectations that could be verified against outcomes in the natural world. For example, according to astrology, one's zodiac sign impacts one's ability to command respect and authority. Since these traits are important in politics, we might expect that if astrology really explained people's personalities, scientists would be more likely to have zodiac signs that astrologers describe as favorable towards science. If used to generate specific expectations like this one, astrological ideas are testable. And I think this is great advice for astrologers and the discipline in general. And it ties into what I said about the previous point. There are some astrologers who work in the field of psychology and have helped bridge the divide between these two disciplines. Liz Green comes to mind. Astrology is not seen as serious in culture by many, and in academia especially. And one way to help push back against that is to be serious as astrologers, and to take oneself seriously, and to learn about science and understand it. So you can have conversations with the scientific community and the skeptical community, and be able to speak their language as well as communicate ours, which is astrology. Also, they bring up a part about the generalized descriptions, which is very much a real issue in astrology, especially in the social media sphere. And this is related to being more serious in our discipline. It's okay to correct someone who says something blatantly incorrect, like on social media or in when they're presenting an idea about astrology anywhere. We must always be okay with critiquing and discussing astrological ideas and pushing our own understanding of it and each other's. And we must correct objectively incorrect statements and ideas, lest we continue to be represented by this kind of pop culture understanding of astrology. Alrighty, next point, relies on evidence. In few cases where astrology has been used to generate testable expectations and the results were examined in a careful study, the evidence did not support the validity of the astrological ideas. This experience is common in science. Scientists often test ideas that turn out to be wrong. However, one of the hallmarks of science is that ideas are modified when warranted by the evidence. Astrology has not changed its ideas in response to contradictory evidence. I think what that is saying is the contradictory evidence that science has presented, and I think that is, again, goes back to the other contentions I have where the misunderstandings in that quote evidence. But I think a better way to put that is, do astrologers in the community, do we test each other? Do we change our ideas if we turn out to be wrong? Are we allowed to? Do we give ourselves that space to be wrong, but then also doesn't mean you throw the baby out with the bathwater, so to speak? And I think that some astrologers don't change their ideas in response to other astrologers, maybe with contradictory quote evidence in the astrological field. And I think that's something that we can work on, is being more open to discourse and being open to sharing ideas and critiquing each other as well, and discussing why we think these things and where it's coming from and how it fits into the rules of the discipline as a whole. Like I mentioned, we need to open up the discourse and the criticism between each other and collaborate on research and bettering the discipline. I think collaboration is very important. It doesn't matter how much you know in astrology. What matters is an honest and earnest attempt, and to just attempt to keep learning. Many astrologers isolate themselves in their own bubble of understanding, and this is not the way. Next point, involves the scientific community. Sharing one's findings and critically evaluating the results of others are not integral parts of practicing astrology. An astrologer can go his or her entire career and not present findings at a scientific meeting or publish a single article. When astrologers do publish, these articles are not usually peer-reviewed or published in places where they will be critically scrutinized by the scientific community. Now, part of that's true. Of course, not very many astrological papers being published to the scientific community, but I think within the astrological community, there is much being published. And I think, I agree that we could be better about being open to critiquing each other, because I think there's this kind of a lot of these assumptions in astrology where it's just like, we just accept what's put out there. And I think that we need to be okay with taking ourselves more seriously This is great advice. I think this entire check sheet is great advice for astrologers as well. And it might not be the intention that this checklist is having, which is basically to just disprove astrology, but we can benefit from these points and incorporate these ideas into our own understanding of astrology and how we research it and better the discipline. To further that, how we communicate is important. So, for example, earlier with the Aries being entrepreneurs example, instead of saying Aries are entrepreneurs, like in general, like when we talk about astrology, one could say Aries can be an entrepreneur or something similar. And when it is a specific expression of the archetype, be clear about that versus communicating the general Aries archetype. Because a lot of misunderstanding in, say, the scientific and skepticism community comes from these, when we say Aries are entrepreneurs, it's like, oh, we assume that they know that not all Aries, it doesn't mean it has to be an entrepreneur. But what we need to be careful of is people who aren't or who don't understand astrology might take that differently and think, oh, well, that means that all Aries are entrepreneurs, meaning that can be easily disproven, meaning that astrology is bad, when that whole chain of information and misunderstanding breaks down, when instead it can be enhanced by clearer language about astrology, especially outside of the astrological community. Communication will help fix misunderstandings in the general population and the scientific community about astrology, as well as allow for the start of clearer and better tests into astrology. Astrologers must not shy away from science because we feel like science is attempting to disprove astrology. That is their role, to be skeptical and to attempt to disprove everything, to attempt to prove things. But we can gain from using science and the tools involved to better understand astrology, like this checklist. Astronomy alone has enhanced astrology tenfold in the past few centuries, with the discovery of many new minor bodies, as well as more precise locations of planets, timing, etc. This is reflected in the human psyche with the explosion in depth of knowledge and depth of the human being, and our ability to start expressing those parts of ourselves. There is a lot of bad astrology, just like in any discipline, even science. But the difference is we must regulate our own discipline, similar to they do. Otherwise, science will feel obligated to. We must mature the discipline if we wish to be taken seriously. All right, next point. Leads to ongoing research. Scientific studies involving astrology have stopped after attempting and failing to establish the validity of astrological ideas. So far, there are no documented cases of astrology contributing to a new scientific discovery. Yeah, astrology, again, this goes back to this is the goal of this entire discussion, is attempting to bridge that so that astrology can add to the scientific discipline and discussion. And I think so, yes, it hasn't led to ongoing research, not scientific research, but in the field itself, there is a lot of research going on. The few studies that have been done have dismissed astrology based on the issues I talked about earlier, the fundamental misunderstandings about astrology. And I don't say that as a cop-out, like, oh, you just don't understand, like, I'm way smarter than you just don't get it. No, I say it genuinely, like, as a call for better experiments, a call for better understanding, and ultimately more knowledge for all, the astrology community as well as the scientific community. And our final point, researchers behave scientifically. Scientists don't wait for others to do the research to support or contradict the ideas they propose. Instead, they strive to test their ideas, try to come up with counter-arguments and alternative hypotheses, and ultimately give up ideas when warranted by the evidence. Astrologers, on the other hand, do not seem to rigorously examine the astrological ideas they accept. As reflected by the minimal level of research in the field, they rarely try to test their arguments in fair ways. In addition, the astrological community largely ignores evidence that contradicts its ideas. Yeah, there's a lot there. Again, yes, there is sort of this kind of persecution syndrome in the astrological community, where we feel like, oh, well, we have something to prove because no one takes us seriously. And I think we need to get over that mentality in a lot of ways. This is kind of a very broad statement that they make here, where to say, like, astrologers, on the other hand, do not seem to rigorously examine the astrological ideas they accept. I mean, that's just not true at all. That's really just an assumption that assumes that we just take the information and regurgitate it back out without thinking about it all. And I think, again, that comes to the fundamental misunderstanding of what astrology is, especially in the science and skepticism community. So, do researchers behave scientifically? If we want to rephrase that, do astrologers behave scientifically, quote unquote? I mean, yes and no. There are many astrologers who do take their discipline very seriously and behave in accordance with the rules of astrology as a whole, who understand the rules and test and push the discipline, who research and study. And astrology, within its closed system, has many rules and is not just a free-for-all. And so in the closed system of astrology, learning the closed system helps to then better be able to understand it or scrutinize it. There are also many bad astrologers, people who just say whatever they want without considering the, quote, rules of astrology. I also think we must update astrology some, update our understanding of astrology. The rules don't really change at all. The language we use to describe them should. Thanks for watching. See you next time. Cheers.